Hello, Spark fans. Welcome back to Advancing Spark, brought to you by Advancing Analytics. This is the third of our little Databricks AI BI Genie mini-series. So in the first video, I showed you what a good experience with using Genie should look like. In the second, more about the steps about how you go about actually building it. So the click here, click here, click here. This is how you produce a thing. And the third one, I want to take a step through some best practice guidelines, more to how to think about building it. More about the Genie strategy you should be using if you're rolling this out in your business. Now, this is going to be based on some documentation, literally just in the Databricks guidelines for actually here's some best practices. And it's kind of best practices, but it's also kind of strategic, how you think about it, how to get the most out of it. So I want to just walk through some of those steps, some of those how we've seen it start to evolve. And obviously, this is all new. We're going to see these evolve and change as businesses get used to having this kind of chat experience as just part of their analytics toolset. But yeah, talk about how we kind of figure these things out. That is planned. As always, if you're new around here, don't forget to like and subscribe. And yeah, let us know if you're already using Genie. Let us know if your business users are collaborating for some kind of chat interface to their data, or if you're struggling to try and get them to think about it. And they're like, no, just give me it in Excel, because that's what I do. And, you know, one day that'll change. Today's not that day. Cool. So let's get started. So I've got this page up. So this is from the Databricks documentation. I'm on the Azure flavor, but it's on all flavors. And it is just the best practices page of the Genie section. And it's a bit of a weird one because it's not just best practices. It's also like the how you go about rolling it out. And that's the important thing about who is the person rolling it out? Who do you roll it out to? How much do you roll out at a time? It's all those kind of questions that just trying to ask. And that's what I want to talk about today, is just trying to shape that, trying to get that in the right place in your head if you're thinking about using this thing. So, okay, let's start having a little look through. So number one, most important of all things, is start small. Now, this is a mistake I made when I first started using Genie. I was just collected like as many tables as I could actually physically get it to have, and then just have it as this really open space where I can just ask any question that pops into my head about the company's data, and I would just get a response. That was my dream. That's what I was thinking of. And that's not what Genie is. That is not how to think about Databricks AI BI Genie. Genie is like having a team of experts, and you go, right, you're the expert in this, I'm going to ask you a question. Oh, you're the expert in this, I'm going to ask you a question. That's how to think about Genie. It is having a selection of tightly focused and scoped chat rooms, so you can ask a certain thing about a certain thing, and it will know what you're talking about. That is the positioning we're trying to go for. So if you're coming from things like, if you're looking at Microsoft's Copilot, you know, and kind of all these kind of like ChatGPT style, super wide general knowledge LLMs, it's a different experience. You can't just go to it and just ask literally anything that comes to mind. You go to the Genie space for the question, the domain expert you're trying to get, and it will answer those questions for you. So keeping it focused is huge. You know, there's a limit to how many tables you can actually get into Genie, but it's going to perform better the fewer tables it has. So they say 5 or fewer, which is, I'd go a couple more, depending on what you're doing. I mean, most of the time, we've already done some data modeling. We've gone and understood the business problems. We've built this into a star schema. So essentially, it's scope it around the star schema with a few dimensions. It should be big old fact table, few dimensions. Maybe you might have a couple of big aggregated summary tables to use instead. But that kind of thing. So if you've done, if you're doing a big rollout of data across your enterprise, and you've actually done a load of groundwork to design data products that are targeted at specific different domains, you've modeled that process, you model that process, model that process. Building Genie rooms around each of those particular data products is kind of how it makes sense. That's how we're starting to think about it. So we're not trying to build one Genie chat room that can answer any business question. It is a bunch of experts around different areas. So keeping it focused, keeping it on a small, when it says small amount of data, that does not mean number of rows. That means just a small number of data objects that can have billions and billions of rows in there. Planning to iterate, absolutely. This is an iterative process. Much in the same way that if you didn't speak to your business users and you designed a dashboard and you wireframed it and you went through a detailed design, then you finally build it and you show it to them, they're going to go, oh, well, that's not really what I need. Because you should iterate on all of these things. Very much the same in Genie. They're going to ask questions you hadn't preempted. They're going to try and use it in a way that you hadn't even dreamed of. And that process of going, iterate. Do some prep, do some planning, try and get it good, but then put it in front of people and iterate has to be the way you build it. It is going to be a living product that slowly augments as people actually onboard it and they evolve it and they go with it. Building on well-annotated tables is an absolute no-brainer. You have to do this on something that actually has the real business context in it. What does that mean? That means Unity Catalog. It means good column descriptions. It means tagging. It means foreign keys and primary keys. It means doing your data modeling and your data governance well. So, way it works, you've got your instructions. That is the general big free text space that gives just general instructions to that Genie room. But it's also got the Unity Catalog metadata. So whenever you ask a question, it just grabs that instruction, the metadata, passes that through to a large language model that knows nothing else about your data. Think about it each time it's fresh. It's just being given the context of the last question you asked in that same chat, any instructions, any metadata. If it's going to be able to know, well, that column name is about that column name is about that, it has to have more context, and it gets that from your column descriptions. So your tables have to have a good description of what that table's for. Your columns have to have good descriptions of this column contains information about this. This column contains information about this. Really important to know, Genie does not see the actual contents of the data. It can never go, well, actually, I'll just run a little query about what, oh, there's only 10 different values in there. I'll use that to drive things. It doesn't have that context. At no point does the actual contents of your tables get sent to that large language model. It is purely the metadata about it that we know that is sent as part of your prompt. So you have to make sure your governance is there. You have to make sure your column descriptions are good. If things are in a certain style, a certain format, it's good to have that in the comments so it knows how to ask that question, knows how to build your where statements and whatnot. Really, 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 really important. Again, yes, data governance is cool again. There's now suddenly a driver to spend a lot of time making sure your governance is up to scratch, because then any kind of AI that's going to be writing queries and asking questions to your data is going to be better. So yeah, kind of makes sense. Have a domain expert define the space. Well, yeah. I mean, it's the age-old problem, right? We've seen so many times a data team, a team of data engineers have been told, okay, you need to write, we need a new data model about this particular process. Go and build something about, I don't know, our manufacturing line, the efficiency of it. And they'll go and root around the source system, find where that information is, build a data model named based on what it's called in the source system, and business users won't have a clue what that means. It is in different terminology. It is in the language of the system, not the language of the people. Same thing here, right? You need someone from the business actually defining, curating, and working with it. Right? If there's an embedded analyst who answers all their business questions, bring them into the story as the curator. Allow them to define the different questions. Allow them to define a lot of the instructions and personality of it. If you are not talking to the business a lot, you're going to have a real hard time building out a Genie chat room that actually captures their interest, that is asking the right questions, that is preempting the terminology and the ways of asking questions that they're going to actually use. So absolutely have someone who's on board doing that. Now, ideally, that first person should be really proficient in SQL, because they're going to be eyeballing the SQL generated. I asked that question, it's generated that. That doesn't seem right. I asked that question, generated that. Oh, no, that's not right. If the person first building it needs to do that sense checking, have you set up in the right way? Is your descriptions right? Is it inferring the wrong information? You need someone to be doing that and nudging it in that right direction. Once it's there, you can start to widen it, and then you start to adjust it and you work with it. Defining the purpose of the space, absolutely. That whole thing of, if you have people log into it and it doesn't have any sample questions, it doesn't have any context, it's really hard to get them to ask the right questions. They're going to think, oh, it's like ChatGPT. I'm just going to ask any question that comes to my mind. I'm going to try and get it to generate an image for me. That is not how Genie works. Whereas if you have a really good description and you have a load of preceded sample questions that whets their appetite for the kind of questions it can answer, and maybe prompts them with some things they haven't really thought about, then they're going to be scoping, they're going to be thinking, oh, okay, I can ask questions about that. Oh, what about this? And start doing it that way. So have it so you go to a particular room and there's a particular flavor, a particular sense, some particular prompts. Just lets people, nudges them in the right direction so they know how to actually work. That, what kind of question should I ask you, is something you can precede the prompt. So it said, well, I'm an expert in these things. Why not ask me these questions? Build that into your instructions so it can actually guide them in the right way. Testing and adjusting, yeah, absolutely. So you've got a curator. So you've got a champion analyst who's had their go themselves. So ideally, it's, I've built this, I've logged in, I understand the domain problem, I'm asking it questions myself, I'm looking at the SQL going, oh, that's not quite right, that's not quite right. I'm kind of going through that process. I'm getting it to the point when the questions I think of off the top of my head, or my domain champion thinks of, it's kind of starting to answer all those questions quite well. So at that point, I've asked it a few things, and it's not quite got the terminology. So I've added details into my instructions to go, if someone asks about year, they mean fiscal year. If someone asks about X, they mean Y, that kind of thing. I've got some translations in there. There's one or two queries that it did okay, but actually there's a way we normally write that query. And I've added that as a preceded bit of SQL. And I'm pretty happy about how it's working. Well, okay, this works for me. I mean, before just hitting a button and putting it live across everyone, you should kind of almost conduct a focus group. Essentially, get a small selection of tame users, I guess. People who have been prepared. People who know that it's not going to be perfect. That's a real challenge in some companies. We talk to lots of clients who are like, no, we can't show anyone the dashboard until it's fully complete, because if there's mistakes in it, they just won't trust the data ever again. And that's really hard, because what you really need is an engaged user base that is working with you. You go, right, okay, we've got our first alpha release. It's going to be okay, some stuff is going to be rubbish at other stuff. Can you give it a go and flag it good or bad? And as soon as you flag something's bad, we'll go and switch around, we'll fix it, and you'll see it improve. And you can be part of this journey. You can help us get to where we need to be. That's the ideal, right? So rather than just pushing out to everybody and then dealing with the wave of problems, going, okay, you 4 or 5 people who understand the domain and have actual questions, I've kind of got it to where I need it to be. But you will never have a scenario where you have preempted all of the things a user will possibly do. Anyone who's done any kind of UI, UX work will know you cannot predict how a user will use your system. You can have a stab, but the best way to actually then know that is to let users use it and go, oh, I didn't think they'd click that button. Okay, same way. They're going to ask questions you hadn't thought about. They're going to do chains of questions. Oh, well, that's interesting. So what about this? Oh, well, can you show me this? And dig into stuff. They're going to work in a way that you're not expecting. Now, Genie has this whole log of this is the question, this is the response, this is the question, this is the response, and it has a feedback mechanism of thumbs up or thumbs down. So if you've actually prepped your users and said, look, I've given this a good stab, I think it can do a lot of things, but you guys are the experts. Can you try and ask this? And anytime it's good, pop a thumbs up. Anytime it's not quite right, even if it's just slightly off, can you give it a thumbs down? And then if you're in this repeated thing of like, they do that for a couple of hours in the morning, in the afternoon, you go on, get all of the responses to how a thumbs down, and then just go, right, okay, we can improve the docs for that one. We can improve the comments in Unity catalog. We can add an instruction for that. Oh, I need to add a SQL query for that. And just go on that iterative process and then ask them to retry that stuff, and they'll get a better experience. And they go, this is it's fixed. It's not a long turnaround. It's not I'll put a request in and then 3 weeks later I might get a change made. It's a real quick iterative, find a problem, it's better. Find a problem, it's fixed. Find a problem, it's fixed. They get engaged. They get asked better questions. They get to the point when, oh, actually, now it's answering all of their questions quite well. Then it's ready to be pushed out to the general public, the general business, to start asking questions on it. So it's that little journey of get it right yourself, get a load of other people to ask a load of questions of it, then roll it out. That's the kind of journey that we're looking at. It's not the same as a very formal application process when you're going to try and preempt and predict everything. It doesn't need to be. Better that it's actually just tested and tried and like evolved with how business actually use it. It's kind of how we're looking at things. So you've gone through that process. You've got it rolled out. You've got some thumbs down coming from your various different users, whether it's live or this is your trial test bed of beta users. What are the problems that can I have? So misunderstanding business jargon, absolutely. If people use shorthand, if they, again, the example here, if they say year, but actually whenever we say year in my organization, they mean fiscal year. If you've got any acronyms, if you've got any shorthand, if you've got any just terms where you say profit, and profit is actually defined by a very specific calculation, and that's not documented anywhere, well, that needs to be documented for Genie to be able to understand it. And that is going back and just adding into your system, adding into your instructions, going, well, if someone says year, they mean fiscal year. If someone says profit, they mean this calculation. And you can add all of those as instructions. Now, last year, Databricks announced that metrics are a thing that's coming. So I'm hoping that that's going to try and replace that, being embedded into instructions to just start to add these things into Unity Catalog. We've not seen that yet. We don't know how much Genie's actually going to work with that. So for now, it's adding it into your instructions pool, and then Genie will just have that logic, have that as a prompt, and use that as it goes forwards. So business jargon, you will see. If people try and use it and it doesn't answer it right, make sure they are prepped to give it a thumbs down. Then you can pick all those up, translate that jargon, and start to collect it. Incorrect table or column usage. So the SQL that it writes is not correct. What's going to happen there? Well, how can we fix it? One, probably means your Unity catalog definitions are not right. Probably means that it might just have very vague, fluffy definitions that overlap between certain columns, which isn't particularly good. So going in, refining those comments, and adding more detail into those column level descriptions. Maybe if you've only got table level descriptions, you've not done it on the column level, you need to go through and finish that. If it doesn't have foreign keys, it's going to help fix it if you have to go and put those things in. If that still doesn't work, so if just having the pure docs right doesn't have enough context, well, adding example queries works. Now, you can only have a limited number of those example queries, and you don't want to get to the point when you have literally every question with an example query. But if there's a specific thing that it's trying to do that it just doesn't get it from the context of your query, yeah, you need to go and add that in. Maybe there's a particular concept where one thing needs to be rolled up as a subquery and it's always used in that certain way. Sure, fine, put an example in there. And sometimes you might just have too much data in there. You might just have, actually, we've got two big fact tables and we've got a load of dimensions and kind of like a constellation thing. Maybe you want to split those out into two different Genie rooms and be very explicit about the kind of questions they cover, in which case you're not going to get as much overlap. It's not going to get confused about which tables to use for a certain thing. Preferably you don't have to get there, but certainly you can go and do that. Filtering errors, if it's having problems with the where statement. So where statement's the interesting one, because where is usually it's going to try and put a specific value into that where statement, where equals, and then a literal string that it passes down. But as we said earlier, it never sees the data. So it doesn't actually know, here's the 10 different strings that are stored in this column. It has to kind of infer that from a bunch of other stuff. So it has to kind of, if you've got enough information in your descriptions to try and give it that info, if you can say, well, as it says here, oh, by the way, this is stored as a 3-letter ISO code, it knows the ISO codes. Whereas if it says, if there's a category, if there's categorization, you know, it can be one of 3 segments, you can include that in your instruction saying this column can be one of these 3 values. Then when it constructs the query, it'll put that in. Now, you can't do that for everything, but be aware of that going, it literally does not know what that data contains. It can only infer it based on what your description of that column is and any context that it's got. So yeah, that's one of the ones that's going to be more, if you have real specific formats of things inside your columns and you're expecting it to be able to write SQL queries that filters it that way, you need to preempt that. You need to try and work around that. Incorrect joins, as we mentioned, you can have foreign keys in there that's going to help that. Again, just the less complex joins you have, the better. Now, this is one of those ones where when Genie first came out, I saw lots of people, one of the first things I did was try to get unmodeled data. Tried to get data that was in like the silver layer of my lake. It was still in its source system. It's still like third normal form coming from whatever garbage I got in. And I was trying to say, yeah, just write a query on that, figure it out, turn it into an analytical model on the fly. And it kind of struggled. So if it has real complex, you need to understand a complex relationship with this that then needs to boil into an aggregation. it's going to try, but it's not going to be 100% successful. So the simpler and more standard your data model, the better. The closer to a straightforward star schema, the better. If you have aggregate tables, even better. So the simpler the thing, the better chance you're going to have. But obviously, the more work you have to do. So a nice balance of going, well, this is the data product I put into my semantic model. I'm going to put a Genie room on top of that. That works for me. I'm just trying to get those things. As says, if it's really a problem, you can kind of just put a view over the top and then just put things on top of it, if it has particularly complex things it's trying to do. Again, metrics we kind of talked about, so we have that, just make sure they're actually sort of baked into things. If you can have anything that's pre-computed as part of the fact, as always, it is the tradition of just calculate everything as far upstream as possible, but as downstream as necessary. Roche's maxim. We need to actually make sure that that is plugged in. So if you can pre-calc anything in your data model, do it. If you can bake anything into your views, do it. Whereas otherwise, make sure it's in your instructions so it actually has the context of how it's doing. Time-based things, if you have a whole mix of time zones, it might not have that context. So again, part of your data model, make sure things are in a standard time zone. Keep things in UTC so it's nice and simple. Or if it's not in UTC, make sure you have the time zone actually properly in there, then I'll actually understand it. Again, try and actually reference things. It's all things like, if someone says, how much we made this year, making sure that year is an understood measure of going, well, what is my financial year? When did my financial year start? Am I talking calendar year? Am I talking financial year? You can plug some of that context in. You just need to preempt it and make sure it's actually in there. You might find that it ignores some instructions occasionally. So if you've got a load of comments and things in there, it might just not get it. So yes, your example SQL will help. Keeping views simple. Keeping your instructions quite simple is a fairly big thing. So it's always tempting in that instructions part to give long verbose sentences. If you were explaining things to a junior developer, you give like a quite verbose explanation, paragraphs explaining these different things. Doesn't need that. You want to keep your instructions short, sharp, just bullet point list of what the different things it's trying to do. Just to keep it very, very simple. I mean, there's no room for misinterpretation. It doesn't need extraneous words and vocabulary to make yourself sound smart. Just say, this is this, this is this, this is this. You don't need to say please in your system instructions because it's just going to make it harder for it to actually understand. And yeah, trying to keep things tight. And again, if it is struggling to actually understand what you're talking about, it's probably because you got the scope of your Genie rooms too wide. You probably got too many different domains trying to wrap into a single one. Keep it focused. If you are starting small and going, here's a fact table, a few dimensions, example questions around it, you shouldn't have problems. It's only if you get into real complex things you're trying to just jam into a single room. Then yeah, performance. If you're trying to do really, really long queries, or it's trying to actually sort of struggle to get there, you can do things like trusted assets. You can actually sort of plug it in and go, well, here's just a Python script to actually go and run and pull back. You can pre-can some stuff that you can plug some performance tuning in if you need to. Generally, you can avoid it. Unreliable responses, yeah. I mean, if something is absolutely incredibly ironclad and important, then yes, you can just pre-can that SQL. Again, similar story. You can only do it so much. And then one of the final ones is this token limit. Now, this is the balance. So the answer that we've been given all the way through this is make sure Unity Catalog has great descriptions. Make sure the tables and columns have great descriptions and you got metadata in there. If all else fails, make sure that the instructions inside your Genie room has loads of examples, loads of contexts, loads of information. Make sure you've got lots of example SQL queries. However, there is a token limit. So like any large language model, they all have a token limit. A token limit is essentially how many characters you can pass in to that as part of your prompt. So your prompt isn't just the question your user's asking. It's the question they're asking, the context within that same chat window, plus the Unity Catalog metadata, plus that system information prompt that we put in there. Jammed all that together, that is the overall token that gets sent. And if you think about going to like ChatGPT and just writing an essay every single time you ask it a question, that can get quite verbose. It can quite big of what is going in there. You might reach a token limit. If it does, it's going to try and handle it itself by prioritizing certain things that it passes through. So it's not going to pass the whole schema, just the schema it thinks is useful. It's not going to pass all the instructions, just the bits that are relevant. And there's the chance there that if it's actually making a decision about how much of that to send through, maybe it's going to actually not send everything that it needs to. Maybe that's why it's not maybe listening to some of your instructions. Maybe that's why it's not getting the right context for the table, because you just tried to get too much in there. So yes, you can remove unnecessary columns, which reduces the amount of metadata it's sending through. Streamlining column descriptions, just keep it real simple. Yeah, it's going to make it easy. Now the trick, it's slightly tricky there, right? Because the whole point of those column descriptions is so a person can read it and understand what's going on there. And we're now saying, well, actually, we're taking the person out the loop and we're passing this to a large language model. It doesn't need a nice, flowery, verbose language. It needs, this is what it actually refers to. And that's tricky because Unity Catalog should be both. We've got two things we're using it for. One, as a data dictionary for actual people to discover stuff. Two, to pass to the large language model, which doesn't need the extra context, which is slightly tricky about how you want, what you want to prioritize in your Unity Catalog descriptions. Simplify instructions, just keep things blunt, easy. No one else is going to read that. Make it super simple. And yes, prune the number of different SQL statements. So that's a tricky bit, right? All of the advice so far has been add more context, add more descriptions, add more examples, add more stuff. And then you'll get to a point when you've got too much stuff in there and you need to start paring it down and streamlining it. That's why starting small, starting really tightly focused, starting with that, we're answering questions about this, is going to set you up for success. So you're not going to get to this point when you then have to go, oh, but we fixed all these things and now we're going to have to squeeze it down and maybe make compromises. That's the kind of thing that we're trying to do. And then, yes, finally, if you're not enabled for cross geoprocessing, you're going to have a problem, and you might reach throughput limits if thousands of people are trying to ask things. So 20 questions per minute across all of your Genie spaces actually isn't that high if you're pushing this out to hundreds of users. So it has a little throughput limit for now, which I'm sure is something as it gets more. What, you're going to only win GA last month? Yeah. So very small amount of things, and that's it. So that is all of the advice that we have coming from Databricks about how to best think about Genie. Now, there's a load of things in there about, specific things you can do to fix stuff. But in reality, it's a fairly easy strategy, right? It's think about a particular problem you're trying to solve, prepare a load of questions and how you want to do that, make sure it can answer your own questions, get a bunch of trusted users who understand that this is an early model that's going to have problems, that won't do everything. Get them into a very tight, very reactive feedback cycle, fix all their problems, get it to the point they can ask questions and they trust it and they start championing it, they start using it, push it out to a wider user base, and then just look after it and iterate it. Keep looking back at the thumbs down. Don't just put it live and then forget about it. Have a weekly review, set up an alert, go and look and go, am I still getting any thumbs downs? Are there any problems that are things? Now, some of those thumbs downs might be from users who just didn't quite get it and were asking the wrong question. We're asking questions outside the domain scope of that thing. That's the education piece. Reach out to them, speak to them, go, hey, just want to talk to you about how this should work. Or maybe you need to improve your documentation or your onboarding. Otherwise, it's we need to add more things to the instructions. We need to add some example SQL, bearing in mind that there is a massive limit that we might need to pare down if it gets to that point. If you're doing those things, if that's how you're thinking about stuff, and you're rolling out these tightly scoped, focused Genie spaces, each with a champion, each with a user group that's committed to making it better, it can be an actually really effective part of your analytics story. It's not replacing data like dashboards. If I just want to see 20 KPIs at once and have a glance if any of them are bad, I'm still just going to look at a scorecard for it. I'm not going to go and ask that question every day. But as soon as I want to go, what's the difference between that? I have to ask someone that question. That's what I'm going to fall back to Genie for. That's what we need to start building this into our workloads. So yeah, interesting times. It's going to be interesting how this actually works in production as we start to see people with it live for 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, what the Genie spaces actually look like. What does it look like once it's been out in the wild for months with that feedback loop going? How well structured are people's instructions? Is it just a chaos of little organic things, or are people actually managing it properly? And how much do we then rip that out and replace it with things like metrics when they come out? Loads of questions in there, lots of things we're looking at. But yeah, certainly interesting times. Hopefully that helps. And yeah, let me know if you actually are getting on board with Genie and you actually are moving it forward. It'd be super interesting to see. Alrighty, that is everything I want to go through. As always, don't forget to like and subscribe, and I'll catch you next time. Cheers.